The Chosen Season 6, Episode 1. A man wrote a check for $300,000 before anyone knew if this show would even survive its first year. Now he wants his day in court. And the reason why has nothing to do with the story on screen and everything to do with what happened behind it. Picture this for a second. It's 2018. There is no Chosen fandom yet. There's no Prime Video deal, no theatrical releases packed with families, no billion-view ambition floating around in press releases. There is just an idea, a pitch, and a filmmaker named Dallas Jenkins asking total strangers to fund a show about the life of Jesus, told through the eyes of the people who actually walked beside him. Most people watching that pitch video saw a passion project. A handful of people saw something else. They saw a bet worth taking. One of those people was a man named Christopher Garabedian. He wasn't some random online donor tossing in $20 for a tote bag or an early screening. He came in with real money, $300,000, at a time when The Chosen was, by every normal business standard, a risk with no track record, no studio backing, no guaranteed audience. Just a concept and a promise that if enough people believed in it, it might actually get made. And it did get made. Not only did it get made, it became one of the strangest success stories in modern entertainment. A crowd-funded, faith-based drama that nobody in traditional Hollywood thought had a real shelf life ended up pulling in hundreds of millions of viewers worldwide. Multiple seasons. International distribution. Spin-offs already in development. A final chapter now, heading to one of the biggest streaming platforms on Earth. By almost any measure, The Chosen didn't just survive. It became a phenomenon. So, here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind right now. If the show became this massive, and if early investors like Garabedian were the reason it even got off the ground in the first place, why is one of its biggest original believers now taking the company that runs it to court? That's not a rhetorical question. It's the entire premise of a class action lawsuit that's now made its way into the Delaware Court of Chancery, a court that specifically handles major corporate disputes. And the claim at the center of it is a serious one. Garabedian isn't just annoyed about how much money he made. He's alleging that he, along with more than 16,000 other minority shareholders, was effectively pushed out of the company at a fraction of what their shares were actually worth. To understand how we got here, you have to understand how The Chosen was originally built. This wasn't financed the way a normal television show gets financed, through a network writing a check or a studio fronting production costs. This was built on the backs of thousands of individual donors and investors who believed in the mission enough to fund it directly. It set records doing it too. The first season alone brought in somewhere around $11 million in crowd-funded backing, an amount that stunned people who track this kind of financing, because television crowdfunding on that scale simply hadn't happened before. That structure is important because it means the early financial architecture of The Chosen wasn't just business. It was personal for a lot of people. Many of the folks who put money in weren't doing it to get rich. They were doing it because they wanted to see a faithful, well-made retelling of the gospel succeed where other attempts had quietly come and gone. But a smaller number of investors, Garabedian reportedly among them, went in with both the mission and the math in mind. They believed in the project, and they also believed that if it worked, it could be genuinely profitable. For a while, that dual motivation didn't create any obvious conflict. The show kept growing. The audience kept expanding season after season. And then the business behind The Chosen started to shift in a way that a lot of casual fans never even noticed. The company restructured. It moved away from its earlier crowdfunding and distribution partnership and into a new corporate identity, eventually becoming the entity, now known as 5 and 2 Studios, a name pulled directly from the biblical miracle of the loaves and fishes. Somewhere in that transition, the original shareholders, the same people who took a chance on this project when it was nothing more than an idea and a prayer, found themselves being cashed out. And this is where the story stops being a feel-good tale about faith-based filmmaking beating the odds and starts becoming something a lot more complicated. According to the lawsuit, the company pursued something called a reverse stock split, a legal maneuver that let it essentially force out smaller shareholders by converting their stock in a way that pushed them below the ownership threshold required to remain shareholders at all. In plain terms, if the allegations are accurate, the very people who helped build The Chosen from nothing were maneuvered out of ownership just as the show was becoming more valuable than it had ever been. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting and where the numbers start doing a lot of the talking. The lawsuit claims that around the time this buyout was happening, third-party bids had valued the company at approximately $150 million. That's the number floating around when serious outside buyers were sniffing around 5 and 2. But when it came time to actually pay out the minority shareholders being squeezed out, the company reportedly valued itself at just under $53 million. Not close to $150 million. Not even half of it. Less than a third. That gap alone is enough to make anyone raise an eyebrow. If outside investors were willing to value the company at one number, and then internal leadership used a dramatically lower number specifically when it came time to pay out the people being pushed to the exits, that's the kind of discrepancy that lawsuits are built around. And it's exactly the discrepancy sitting at the heart of Garabedian's case. Now let's talk about the part of this lawsuit that honestly surprised me the most, because it's not just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about timing, and timing is everything when you're trying to prove that something was done deliberately rather than by accident. According to the complaint, the vote to approve this reverse stock split, the move that ultimately cashed out those minority shareholders, didn't happen on some random Tuesday in the middle of a normal business quarter. It happened during Holy Week. For anyone who isn't familiar, Holy Week is the 7 days leading up to Easter, the most sacred stretch on the entire Christian calendar. It's the week churches hold their biggest services of the year. It's the week families travel, attend Good Friday services, prepare for Easter Sunday, and generally have their minds on faith and family, not corporate paperwork. And here's the thing that makes this allegation land so hard. The shareholders being asked to vote on this were, by and large, deeply religious people. Many of them didn't invest in The Chosen because they were chasing a return. They invested because they believed in telling the story of Jesus well. So, if you wanted to schedule a vote at a moment when the exact people you're trying to push out would be least likely to be paying close attention to their inbox, Holy Week would be, according to the lawsuit, a strategically convenient time to do it. The numbers seem to back up that theory in an uncomfortable way. The lawsuit states that roughly 80% of shareholders did not vote at all. Now, you could read that a couple of different ways. Maybe most of these investors genuinely didn't care about the financial mechanics because they never invested for financial reasons in the first place. That's entirely possible and honestly probably true for a large chunk of them. But if you're the company running that vote, and you already know that a huge percentage of your shareholder base is unlikely to engage with corporate governance during the busiest religious week of the year, that's not exactly an oversight. That's either lucky timing or calculated timing, and the lawsuit is arguing it was the latter. Then there's the part of the complaint that might be the most emotionally loaded of all. The lawsuit alleges that the company used money that had originally been set aside for producing the final season of The Chosen and redirected it to help finance the very buyout that pushed these shareholders out. Sit with that for a second. If true, that means funds meant to bring fans and investors the ending of a story they'd supported for years were instead used, at least in part, to remove the people who helped make that ending possible in the first place. It's the kind of detail that turns a dry corporate dispute into something that feels almost like a betrayal, especially for an audience that has followed this show specifically because of its message about faith, generosity, and doing right by people. Let's not forget who we're talking about here either. Garabedian wasn't some anonymous investor who wired money and walked away. According to the lawsuit, he was introduced to The Chosen through the very short film Dallas Jenkins used to kick off fundraising in the first place. He didn't just fund the show. He was credited as a co-executive producer on its first season. He held roughly 150,000 shares of minority stock. And when the buyout happened, those shares were reportedly cashed out at $3.75 each, against his objections, netting him around $560,000 total. Now, on the surface, that might sound like a solid return. He put in $300,000 and got back over $500,000. That's not nothing. But context matters here, and this is where a lot of people online have been going back and forth. The Chosen didn't just modestly succeed. It became one of the biggest independent media stories in recent memory, watched by hundreds of millions of people worldwide, with international licensing deals, a Prime Video partnership for its final chapters, and multiple spin-offs already greenlit. If a company grows that explosively, and outside bidders are valuing it at $150 million, a return of $560,000 on an early, high-risk investment starts to look a lot smaller by comparison. That's the core argument Garabedian's legal team appears to be making. Not that he got nothing, but that he got a fraction of what his early risk and his stake in the company's runaway success should have actually earned him. On the other side of this, you have Dallas Jenkins and the leadership at 5 and 2 Studios pushing back hard against the entire premise of the lawsuit. In public statements, Jenkins has said the company has operated with transparency and accountability from the very beginning, that it followed every legal and financial requirement along the way, and that any accusation of wrongdoing is flatly false. He's expressed confidence that a full legal review will back that up completely. That's a pretty firm stance, and it's worth noting that this isn't a company with a public history of shady dealings. If anything, over the years, The Chosen has more often been the one dealing with legal and financial complications caused by outside parties, rather than creating them. So now you have two very different stories sitting side by side. One version says a group of early believers were quietly and strategically pushed out of a company they helped build, right as it was becoming worth more than any of them could have imagined. The other version says this was a legitimate corporate restructuring, handled properly, and that the numbers being thrown around by the plaintiff's legal team don't tell the full story of how business valuations actually work. Somewhere in the middle of those two narratives is the truth, and that's exactly what a judge in Delaware is now going to have to sort out. So, where does that leave us right now, in the middle of two very different versions of the same story? On one side, you have a lawsuit that paints a picture of calculated timing, inflated promises, and a company that allegedly used the language and calendar of the very faith it was built to honor as a tool to quietly push people out. On the other side, you have a filmmaker and a company insisting they've done nothing but follow the rules, and that they're not just willing but eager for a court to confirm it publicly. Both of those things can't be fully true at the same time, and that's exactly why this is now sitting in front of a judge instead of getting settled over a phone call. Here's what I think is genuinely worth sitting with, though, regardless of which side ends up being right in the eyes of the law. The Chosen was never supposed to be a normal business story. It was built on the idea that ordinary people, moved by faith rather than financial strategy, could come together and fund something meaningful without needing a major studio's permission to do it. That idea worked. It worked so well that it rewrote the rulebook on what independent, faith-based media could actually accomplish. And now, years later, the very structure that made that success possible is the same structure being picked apart in a courtroom, with lawyers arguing over stock splits, valuation gaps, and the timing of a shareholder vote. There's also something worth acknowledging about the 80% of shareholders who reportedly never voted at all. Whether that was disinterest, distraction during a sacred week, or simple trust in leadership they'd supported for years, it says something powerful about who these original investors actually were. Most of them weren't in this for a payday. They wanted to see the gospel told well, and they got exactly that. Only a small number, Garabedian among them, appear to be measuring their involvement in dollars and cents rather than mission and meaning. That doesn't make his legal claim invalid. If the allegations about the valuation gap and the timing of that vote are accurate, that's a legitimate issue worth a court's attention no matter who's raising it. But it does add an extra layer of tension to a story that's already uncomfortable because it forces fans to ask a question they probably never expected to ask about this particular show. Did the business side of something built on faith end up operating the exact opposite way? We don't have the final answer yet, and honestly, nobody outside that courtroom does either. What we do know is that The Chosen is standing at an unusual crossroads. It's finishing its story on screen, heading into its most anticipated chapters, yet with a crucifixion and resurrection arriving on one of the largest streaming platforms in the world, while simultaneously defending itself in a courtroom against the very people who helped write its origin story off-screen. Two very different chapters, unfolding at the exact same time, and both of them are still being written. What happens next matters, not just for Garabedian and the other shareholders named in this case, but for how future faith-based and independently funded projects choose to structure themselves going forward. If this lawsuit succeeds, it could change how crowd-funded media companies treat their earliest supporters for years to come. If it fails, it could just as easily be remembered as an attempt by one investor to turn a shared act of faith into a bigger personal payday. Either way, this case is going to set a precedent that reaches far beyond one show and one company. At the end of the day, this story is a reminder that even the most inspiring underdog success stories carry complicated business realities underneath them. The Chosen changed the way millions of people experience the story of Jesus on screen. But behind every camera and every episode, there was also a business, with contracts, valuations, and shareholders, and business doesn't always move in the same spirit as the mission it was built to serve. Whether this ends in vindication for Dallas Jenkins and 5 and 2 Studios, or in a costly reckoning for how early investors were treated, one thing is certain. This is far from over, and how it resolves could shape the future of faith-based filmmaking in ways we're only beginning to understand. If this story surprised you the way it surprised me, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep covering stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there's a lot more happening behind the scenes of The Chosen than most people realize, and I'll be right here breaking it down as it happens. And I want to hear from you. If you were one of the original investors or crowdfunders, or if you've just been following the story from the outside, drop a comment and let me know what you think. Do you think this lawsuit has real merit, or do you think this is one investor trying to squeeze more out of a success story he already benefited from? I'll see you in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.